Now, what I'm going to talk about in this episode of the DL Jones Book Show is creative nonfiction. Okay, so one of the first books that I read on my own, and when I say on my own, I'm talking about not a book that I had to read for school, not one I had to do a report on or anything like that. I'm talking about a book that I actually went out to a store, bought the book on my own, from my own doing. Was a book called Makes Me Want to Holler. This book was written by an author named Nathan McCall. And when I say creative nonfiction, I'm talking about nonfiction stories, nonfiction books that actually tell a story as if it were like a fiction book. This book or story is a nonfiction story, but it's all told in a way as if you were reading any other fiction things that has been written out there. And I'm just wondering, do you like creative nonfiction? Do you listen to creative nonfiction when it comes to audiobooks? Do you read creative nonfiction? How do you like it, as compared to, traditional nonfiction? Okay, so the name of this book, the title of this book, the full title is Makes Me Want to Holler, A Young Black Man in America. And it is written by Nathan McCall. Now, Nathan McCall, he's the author, and this is basically like a memoir. It's a story of his life, of how he grew up and things that happened to him, which his life, his early life wasn't that great. He grew up, kind of a tough life. He ended up going to prison at the age of 20 for armed robbery. And the book is just basically talking about his whole life. And of course, if you've ever heard of this book or heard of Nathan McCall, after he got out of prison and everything, he got his life back straight, and he, ended up, going to college and everything like that, and ended up landing a job at Washington Post, which is when he published this book. It was published, I want to say in like 1994 and 95, something like that. The thing about this book that really captured me at that time was that it read like a drama, like a urban gritty drama, like almost like a crime drama. It tells his story growing up. And another thing that captured my attention a lot was that he grew up in Portsmouth, Virginia, which at the time I was living in Newport News, Virginia. And if you know anything about those two cities, they're both in the same metropolitan area, the Hampton Roads area, which includes Norfolk, Virginia Beach, Hampton, Newport News, Portsmouth, and Chesapeake. So a lot of the locations that he talked about in the book were locations I was familiar with. Either I had been there before, or I knew of those locations, or I've heard people talk about those locations and stuff like that. So it was like he was telling a story based on his life, which was, had a lot of things going on in his story, him growing up. But it took place in what I pretty much, even though I didn't live in Portsmouth, Portsmouth is probably about a good 20-30 minute drive from where I lived. It kind of felt like it was from the same area where I lived, like he was telling me a story about something that happened in my neck of the woods. So it just made it interesting. It's interesting when you read a story like that, filled with drama and filled with a lot of things, and it takes place in an area that you're familiar with, an area that as you're reading the things on the pages, you can see those streets and those locations because you've driven past there before. He was older than me, so I didn't grow up in the same time frame as he did. So a lot of those things that happened, that he talked about in that book were things that happened, well before my time. Just the whole thing, just reading a story like that, and I knew it took place basically where I'm from, stuff like that. It just made the whole book very interesting. And this is a person that I could almost consider like a hometown person. He wrote a book, and at that time, like back at 94, 95, writing a book to me seemed like a huge deal. Like I've written books now and I've published books now, but times are different now than compared to back then. Back then, someone said they wrote a book and it's published, you can go in the bookstore and buy it. To me, that was a huge deal. So it just felt like, I don't know, it's sort of like, how sometimes people would say like the small town kid done good or whatever, something like that. I don't know if I got that phrase right, but I kind of had that kind of feeling when I read that book, and it was just interesting. It came out around the time where there were a lot of movies about the Black experience, about growing up in the hood, stuff like that. Boys in the Hood and Don't Be a Menace to Society. Movies like that were movies that were popular around that time. And this book, even though it was a book and not a movie, it kind of fell in line with those type of stories, but it was true, or it's based on his life. So when I read it with the understanding that this is a true story. Now, after reading that book, of course, I was so into that book and that story that I started looking for other similar types of stories. Basically, stories where I felt like I was represented in those stories, whether they were based on true stories or just, completely made up. And it ended up leading me to Donald Goins, which is another author. He wrote a lot of stories that featured black characters that took place in black neighborhoods and black environments and stuff like that. So, and his books were pretty short. At that time, a short book like a lot of the books that Donald Goins wrote was right up my alley. My taste as far as my reading has changed a lot since then. These days, I mean, this may be bad to say, but I could care less about reading somebody's memoir. Unless you're like some kind of historical figure or like a celebrity, and even in that case, I don't really care that much. I really have no interest at all in reading about someone's life story. It has to be something in particular about that particular person that would draw me to it. But just some random person's memoir about what they did growing up or what they did when they went overseas or anything like that, I have no interest at all in reading anything about that kind of stuff. I like fiction now, more so than nonfiction. Now, when I do read nonfiction, it's usually not creative nonfiction. It's usually where I'm trying to learn something. The most recent nonfiction that I've read has probably been a book about being an introvert. And I'll show it up on the screen right here. But that was I've read that book a couple of years ago. Actually, I've read more nonfiction since then, but that's probably the one that I remember the most out of my most recent nonfiction reads. Cause I'm a bit of an introvert myself, and this book pretty much show you that, you don't have to hide being an introvert. You can, this book basically shows you how to use being an introvert as a benefit more so than as something that you try to hide from people or something that you try to break out of. It made me realize that being an introvert is not a fault. It's just that, you have introverts and you have extroverts and you have people that's in between. And and if you're an introvert, this is just how you are. Deal with it. Make it work for you. And that book helped me, to realize that. Whereas before, I guess I didn't do it publicly, but to myself, I kind of tried to want to fight the fact that, I'm a bit of an introvert. Other nonfiction books I've read recently, I read a book called Hookology. And it's just basically sort of similar to like a marketing book, but you get the picture. Most of the nonfiction books I've read since that time has been books where I read it because I wanted to learn something. They were tech books, or I wanted to learn something about some type of tech, or I wanted to learn something about some kind of theory. I've been doing a lot of writing lately, so I read books on craft as far as writing. I don't hardly read any stories like back then where it's a nonfiction book, but it's about someone's life or about something someone did. I don't read those that much because, like I said, to be honest with you, I don't care. This may be bad to say, but there's got to be a reason for me to care about something like that. And if it's just a random person and I don't know the person other than from what they are talking about in their book, a lot of times I don't care. And I'm sorry. But yeah, what do you think about creative nonfiction? Now, one thing I remember about Makes Me Want to Holler is that it read like a regular book. It read like a fiction book, and it really captured my attention because of that. How do you feel about nonfiction books? Do you like nonfiction books that actually tell a story that when you read it, other than it's supposed to be based on some real events or a person's life, is basically telling the story just like if you were reading any other story, a thriller or a romance novel or something like that? Do you like those type of books? Is that something that captures your attention? Is that something that you look for when you go out and try to pick out your next book to read? I'm curious about that. I'm wondering how many people are into creative nonfiction. Stories can come from anywhere. A story doesn't always have to be something somebody made up. You can have things that happen to people in real life that they can recount that will be just as, exciting or interesting as any fiction that you read. I'll put links to a couple of the books that I was talking about in the description if you wanted to check those out. Makes Me Want to Holler. Like I said, I read that back in the 90s. I don't know how well it holds up now. I remember back then it was really, really good and it really captured my attention. I actually bought the paperback. Well, I guess back then I didn't have a choice. I don't think ebooks were out back then. But and if you have any, like I said, a lot of times my interest doesn't lie within that genre anymore. But if you have something that you think is really good that you want to mention to me, let me know in the comments. I'll check it out. I'll take a look. I'll at least read the blurb to see if I can find some interest in it. But that's the end of today's show. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye. You made it to the end of the video. Thank you for watching. While you're here, why don't you check out that video right there, or maybe that one right there. And while you're at it, go ahead and click my image in the middle there and subscribe to this channel.